Of NAMI at Home Live. We welcome all of the folks on YouTube. If you're not already subscribed to YouTube, you should be. Like if you're watching on Facebook and you'd rather watch on YouTube, you can do that. Now, if you're watching on YouTube and you'd rather watch on Facebook, you can do that too. The important thing is you just like, follow, and subscribe wherever you are, including like multiple places. Everybody has multiple devices. You can watch us on Facebook and on YouTube. Stereo Gabe. And also, if you want to know where we do everything, how we do everything, and why we do everything, you can check out our website at namitn.org, and you can subscribe to our email list also at namitn.org. It is absolutely free, and you find out all of the things that NAMI Tennessee is doing. Things like this, things like our gala, things like our walk, and of course, important legislative advocacy that you can participate in. It is absolutely free, and despite the jokes, I do not get a toaster if you sign up, but I really encourage you to do so. All right, that is enough housekeeping. Let's bring on our super cool guest, Natasha. Tell the folks who you are.
Hi, Gabe. So I'm glad to be here today, and happy day, everyone, to NAMI Tennessee. So my name is Natasha Tracy, and I am a mental health advocate, and I have been professionally for about 12 years. I'm a writer and speaker, and actually I'm a podcast host myself. So hopefully this will be really good, which will look good for my podcast. And I've written a book on bipolar disorder and depression. I write for Healthy Place, and I'm pretty much everywhere online. Now, I've been doing this, as I said, for 12 years. So I have written more than 1,000 articles on bipolar disorder.
Wow, when I hit 100, I was like, that's so many articles. Like that's just an obscene number of articles. And you have like 10 times that many.
I've been doing it for a while.
That's true. That's true. Natasha, thank you so much for being here. So let's sort of start a little bit at the beginning. This is mental illness in the workplace, and many people are like, oh yeah, we've been talking about mental health in the workplace for, I mean, at least 2 years. Ever since the pandemic, we've just been mental health. But I can't help but notice that yours specifically says mental illness in the workplace. So my first question is, isn't workplace mental health and mental illness in the workplace just the exact same thing?
So not at all. And thank you for asking that question. So my podcast is about mental illness in the workplace. And what I say every week, and what's really important to understand, and I'm sure people in NAMI do, every single person has mental health, but only 1 in 5 people actually have a diagnosable mental illness. And it's really important to actually tell the difference between those two things. And in my particular case, I want to shine the light on the 20% of people with a diagnosable mental illness, because I believe that it is the case that we are often forgotten when it comes to mental health conversations.
I could not agree with that more. I don't want to fall down a rabbit hole here, but of course, as the mental health conversation has expanded, I sort of feel like the mental illness conversation has sort of shrunk a little bit. The biggest example that I always use is there was that viral article that went around that said, I asked my boss for a mental health day and he said yes. And that was wonderful. Nobody is saying that a mental health day is a bad thing. I don't want anybody to hear that NAMI Tennessee, Gabe Howard, or of course the great Natasha Tracy is insulting a mental health day. But the question that many of us advocates asked ourselves is, what if it was a mental health week? What if it was a mental health 4 to 6 weeks? What if it was a mental health short-term disability situation? What if it was a mental health I can only work half days? What if it was a mental health reasonable accommodations are needed? Where would that fit in? And everybody was like, mental health day. So thank you, Natasha, for expanding the conversation into mental illness in the workplace, because of course, folks like you and I who live with bipolar disorder, while mental health conversations are fantastic, we want to work too.
Yes, 100%. Before I became professional advocate, I was in tech for 10 years. And of course, I was in tech with a mental illness. And if you think anyone ever talked about mental illness in the workplace at that point, you would definitely be wrong. So I am really honored to be able to move that conversation forward a little bit.
Well, I love that. Now, I know you've talked a little bit about being mentally ill in the workplace and working in tech, but let's go ahead and expand that. Your personal experience of mental illness at work. I know you've got a great story and you learned a lot. Can you please share some of that with our viewers, please?
Sure. So I guess, so in my 10-year period, I had 3 different workplaces. And so my experience with mental illness in the workplace was actually different depending on the place that I was in. So when I was younger, in my first workplace, it was a very difficult workplace from a mental illness perspective because we were expected to do things that actually harmed our mental health. So for example, I had to work 24 hours one day. And that was, so up overnight. That's something I would never agree to today, but is
Wow.
definitely something, yeah, it was something that I had to do because tech is weird and you do things in tech. And, I would never do that today, but it's something that I did then. Now, luckily for me, at that point, I wasn't as sick as I am today and as I was, say, 10 years from then. So I managed to get through those times, but it's not something I would ever do. And then at my next company, actually, what happened for me was within 6 months of joining that company, I ended up in the hospital for suicidality. And actually, this was because I changed companies that I actually ended up in the hospital. And it's not because the new company was bad in any way. It's because my own internalized stress and pressure of changing jobs and going into a new workplace where I didn't know anyone and I didn't know the job and all that kind of stuff just took a toll on my mental illness to the point where I was acutely suicidal and I had to be hospitalized for it. And it was a huge blow to me personally, because certainly I never would have thought that changing jobs would be a stressor to the degree when I would end up in a hospital. But that is what happened. And then in the third job, it was at a very fancy tech company in the United States. And I knew, because of my last job where I did end up in the hospital, I knew to watch for the signs. I knew to try and make it easier on myself. I knew to try and deal with stress more effectively. But even though I had better coping skills and even though I saw it coming, I actually ended up having to take time off for short-term disability again. And it was something that I ended up having to do, even though everything was better for me interpersonally, it just didn't matter. My mental illness just reacted that way to the stressor. And it was a very big stressor. I had to move countries and I had to change jobs and I had to start work at a place where, everyone was brilliant and the job was incredibly hard. And it was the kind of workplace where people would actually stab you in the back if they thought it would give them a better review come September. So it was really challenging. But like I said, even though I saw it coming, there was just nothing I could do to avoid basically the roadblock of my mental illness at that time.
Now, I could ask you a million questions about this. For starters, I worked in tech around the same time as you, so our stories are so similar. When you said people will stab you in the back just to get a little bit of head, tech was very competitive, and it was a lot of young people, and it sort of had this almost like rock star mentality to it.
Yes.
I tell people that I really did play video games and played ping pong at work because they were doing so many things to keep us there. Like at the time I thought, hey, this is a really cool workplace. They're bringing in food. They have a cooler stocked with different drinks and yeah, that's because they love us. And in actuality, it's because it was free overtime. If they could keep us there for 10, 12, 16 hours a day by stroking our egos and providing us food and activities, we would just work more. And it had that whole sort of vibe to it that I think people still to this day think we're exaggerating about. But we're not. They would have let us live there if they could, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in my particular workplace, it was a more mature workplace than some of the tech workplaces were at the time. And so there was talk about work-life balance. It's just that from what I could tell, it was mostly talk. That's all.
It's super, super easy to talk about it. I want to let people know that there's just a lot of workplaces, and tech was just a really good example, especially since it's sort of been pulp culturalized. we hear about like the Google pods where you can take a nap during work, and they're like, oh, well, Google keeps you on their campus because they love you, or Google offers you all this stuff because they love their employees. No, Google wants to keep you there. And I know what you mean about this work-life balance is always sort of this discussion, but it's never an action. And I think it's just important to realize that that was a genuine thing in tech, but let's expand that out. It's a genuine thing everywhere. There's always these conversations about, hey, if you take too long of a lunch because you want to go to your kids' parent-teacher conference, or if you want to take a half day because you want to be there for your best friend's graduation or party or celebration, or if you just take a 3-day weekend because you want to take a 3-day weekend, there's always that, while I'm gone, who's going to move in on my turf? And that sort of anxiety keeps a lot of people working more than they can. Now, when we apply that to bipolar disorder and serious and persistent mental illness, it's hard enough to deal with that when you're not also managing a mental illness. So I know that's really the entry point that we want people to be thinking about, because many people are like, well, that just sounds sucky no matter what. So now it's sucky managing a mental illness, and then there's that convergence. And that leads me to my next question, Natasha. How many people are managing that? How many people do have a mental illness in the workplace? I mean, approximately. I know you didn't count them.
Yeah, I didn't personally count them. Actually, the number isn't really known because people don't do the studies that actually would indicate whether a person with mental illness is in the workplace or not. There are some populations that we can estimate. So the minority of people with bipolar disorder tend to be in the workplace. For example, many more of those people are on disability than, say, an anxiety disorder, where most of those people are in the workplace. But in terms of exact numbers, we just don't know. And I think that actually speaks a lot to how much we care about this issue, which is to say that we're just starting to care, maybe, because we certainly haven't shown that we care up until now. But I'm hoping that, we can do that, because as much as work-life balance was a discussion when I was in tech, I believe it's the same conversation as mental health at work. That's the same conversation that they're having. It's just labeled slightly differently. And so as much as work-life balance often didn't come to pass at work, I think mental health, that conversation also doesn't come to pass at work.
I'm just fascinated that we're still having the same conversation 12, 15, 20 years later. One would think, if I said, hey, we've started working on this, and I'm going to call it an issue. Like, I won't even call it a problem, right? Like, we've noticed our employees are going through some stuff or not having the optimal time. So we're going to discuss it and fix it and move forward. And I said, okay, we're not done yet. How long do you think we've been working on it? I wouldn't expect somebody to say 10, 15, 20 years.
Right.
It sort of indicates that maybe it's just lip service, because, for example, that's generational. Right. I think the new generation of workers are like, hey, we've cracked it. We're finally talking about it. But the previous generation of workers is like, yeah, they did that to us too. They did the exact same thing to us.
I think that's entirely true, right? I think there are issues like that get a new name, but actually are the same issue, and they just keep passing them down the line, because there is a recognition that people are like whole 3-dimensional beings, right? It's not that you are this automaton that can work and that's all. There is a recognition of that, and there has been a recognition of that for a really long time. But the question is, what does a company actually do to admit that and to actually put that as part of their culture? And some companies have managed to successfully do that. I interviewed a woman who was a CEO, and she had bipolar disorder. Now, this is an extraordinary thing. I don't know that I ever would have said that a person with bipolar disorder could be a CEO, but she was. And she sort of designed her job with the structures in place such that she could be the CEO and still have bipolar disorder. So she did all these sorts of things and brought in all these benefits to make her position work for her. And then she rolled that out to all of her employees as well. So they have all kinds of really fascinating benefits there where, if something unexpected happens and the person doesn't have the money for it, the company may step in and actually help with an expense that the person didn't know that they were going to have, like a broken car, for example. Now, when you think about it, this actually makes sense. If the person, your employee, has a broken car, they can't get to work. It actually is in your benefit as a company to help them rectify that situation. Most companies, of course, would never consider doing that. But her company does. And so it's possible, right? It's possible that workplaces can do this. They can make it part of their culture. It's just very difficult. And in her particular case, she actually had run the numbers on it. And because she managed to keep all her staff, no one ever left that company because the benefits were so great and she was so amazing. Because of that, she very rarely had to hire and train new employees. And because she got to avoid the churn of employees leaving and new employees arriving, that actually saved her money. So even though she did give all kinds of benefits to her employees, in the end, it was a net positive for the company and not a net negative. And I just think that more companies need to see the bigger balance sheet and look at it and understand that for the company, it's actually a benefit, and it's economically a benefit, along with, many other ways it's a benefit as well.
I love everything that you just said, from the CEO with bipolar disorder to the looking at things differently. I do often feel that the money is being spent in retraining, replacement, overtime, lost productivity because people are moving in and out, morale issues, etc. And if we just invested more in the employees, you could reduce some of that. And even if it evened out, hey, at least you'd end up with happier employees. I mean, that's its own benefit. I recognize that's over on the mental health side, and we're talking about mental illness, but hey, people with mental illness have mental health as well, right?
Yes.
So we've been talking about bipolar a lot. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that there's more than just one mental illness in the workplace. What mental illnesses are found in the workplace, other than, of course, bipolar disorders?
Right. So when we talk about mental illness in the workplace, we are talking about that 1 in 5 people who have a diagnosable mental illness. And so those mental illnesses do range from mild to severe. So they can be anything from like social anxiety disorder to, say, a phobia, something that you maybe wouldn't encounter even in the workplace, but the person does have a mental illness, all the way to something through to something that would be considered more severe, something like schizophrenia, for example. So we're actually talking about every mental illness that there is when we talk about the 1 in 5 people who have a diagnosable mental illness. And they're all in the workplace in some form or another.
Natasha, thank you so much. So I know earlier on you said it's very difficult to know just how many people are in the workplace living with mental illness because, well, one, nobody's studying, but there's another issue aside from nobody's really checking or looking, or I hate to say that nobody cares, because that's not the right word. But there's also disclosure in the workplace. Many people who live with mental illness don't want to disclose that in the workplace because, well, it's problematic. We'll just go with it's problematic, which leads me to my next question. Should people disclose in the workplace? Should Natasha Tracy show up on day one and say, hey, I'm super excited to be here and I have bipolar disorder? What are your thoughts on whether or not people should disclose at work?
So I've been asked this many, many times, and I will say that there are workplaces where this might be more of a good idea, and there are workplaces where this might be less of a good idea. But what I always say to the person asking the question is this: how much do you need the job? Because honestly, that's what you need to consider. If everything goes wrong, how much do you need that job? You might think that the employer will react well. You might think that your fellow employees will react well, but you might be wrong. So how much do you need that job? If you're telling me that if you miss one paycheck, you're going to be out on the street, then I would suggest that telling people at work that you have a mental illness, especially something like bipolar disorder that is highly stigmatized, I would suggest that that's not such a good idea. If on the other hand, you have savings or you have a spouse that works or something like that, and if you missed a paycheck or two, it wouldn't be the end of the world, and maybe you have a mental illness that is more acceptable, then I would say maybe that's something you could share. But it's really a personal question and it depends on a lot of different variables. But take that decision very seriously because there's no putting it back in the box.
One of the questions that always comes up about whether or not people should disclose at work is the what if you have to? What if you have to disclose because you need those reasonable accommodations? So keep that in mind. The person needs to disclose because they need a reasonable accommodation. What would you recommend in that way? Like, how should they disclose? Like, I made the joke of Natasha showing up and saying, "Hi, it's my first day at work. I have bipolar." That would be an example of how not to disclose.
Right.
Right. So, what would be an example of, I hate to say a good way to disclose, that's not really what I mean, but a productive, professional, best case scenario way to disclose if you do need those accommodations?
So I think that it's just like any other discussion with your manager, right? You don't go to your manager and say something wishy-washy and emotional and without detail and without information. You don't do that when you go to your manager, or at least I hope you don't do that when you go to your manager. So, I once learned from a course that I went on, management doesn't care what the problem is, they care what the solution is. So if you think of your mental illness as the problem, the accommodation is actually the solution. So when you walk into your boss's office, it's not the mental illness that they care about as much as it is the accommodation. Is it reasonable? Can they do it? What is it? Et cetera, et cetera. That's what they really care about because that's actually the solution. So if it were me and I needed to talk to my manager about having bipolar disorder, I would tell them just factually, I have bipolar disorder and I have a need for an accommodation. It is the following. And then I would also offer helpful information about bipolar disorder, such as things like, I'm going to continue to work here. I love my job. I'm not going anywhere. I don't need disability at this time, nothing like that. I just need this reasonable accommodation in order to facilitate my work. And if it really came down to it, I'd even bring them printed material about bipolar disorder that would help them educate themselves about that illness, because most people don't know the facts about bipolar disorder. Most people know a lot of myths, but most people don't know the facts. So you want to hand them the facts so that they can make a really good decision about your accommodation request.
So obviously we are on the if a person chooses to disclose at work, how should they do it question. There's so many directions that this could go. And that's sort of the theme of this, because I want to make sure that people listening understand that this is not a one size fits all for so many reasons. For the biggest one is different mental illnesses are looked at and unfortunately stigmatized differently. Some are just easier to disclose and we get more buy-in from. Others carry scarier myths, for lack of a better phrasing. The thing that I like about what you just said, Natasha, is stick to the facts and be confident. This isn't a wishy-washy thing. I do think that a lot of people upon disclosure tend to disclose in a way that's like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to be, this is really hard for me. And it as much as I hate to say it, it ruins your negotiating power. The person can tell that you're being apologetic, therefore if you don't have a good manager, if you have somebody that, if you just have somebody that doesn't understand, they may see this as an opportunity to poke holes in what you're doing. Whereas if you walk in and say, I'm entitled to this reasonable accommodation, I've done my research, here's what I have, here's what I need, you do this for me, I will do this for you, negotiation over, all of a sudden your odds of having a good outcome go up. So I think that's worth stressing, because we do have this tendency to feel bad, and we project that onto the people we're telling.
Yeah, if you apologize for something, what you're indicating is that there's something to apologize for. And there's nothing to apologize for when it comes to a mental illness. A mental illness is an illness like any other. Don't apologize if you have cancer. Do not apologize if you're paraplegic. And for goodness sake, don't apologize if you have a mental illness. It's all the same. None of it is your fault. So yeah, walk in there confidently, because the fact that you have a mental illness is one tiny thing about you. And the myriad of other things about you are the things that your employer is going to care about, hopefully.
It's also important to remember that even in, America is this vast place, and different states have different rules. There are federal guidelines, of course, but there's also state guidelines, and there's also even city guidelines. It can be it, it can be a mess. It can certainly be very challenging. And even under those guidelines, different size companies have different rules. I only point this out because there's always like the person in the support group that's like, oh no, they can't do that. That's a law. You have absolute protection, and then that person goes and does it, and they don't have protection because the person who gave the advice works for a corporation that has over 100 employees. So they have one set of rules, and the person who followed the advice works for a small business that has 5 employees. And I'm not the government, but the government has decided that those businesses are exempt from certain disability and discrimination laws, et cetera, especially as it pertains to mental illness. So it's really, really important to get your advice from a legal professional or a workplace professional. And in the States, there are many options in different cities, et cetera. Google it. There's, I don't want to say nonprofits because they're government run, right? But they are employee protection agencies where, like, for example, if you don't get your last paycheck, many of us know who to call if we don't get our last paycheck. Many of those same places are also the place that you can call to get advice on your rights as a person living with mental illness. So I strongly encourage you.
And not to plug my podcast again, but I'm going to.
Plug.
This week on Thursday, we actually have a lawyer who's going to be on the show, and the show is live, so you can ask questions of this particular disability advocate lawyer, and she will hopefully be able to give you some general guidance about what your rights are and what the employers have to do with regard to mental illness in the workplace.
I love that, and I'm sitting here now. I'm the voice in the sky. I was looking for the little scroll so that people know where to go. Natasha, awesome. Thank you so much. Cody Green, who is the schizophrenic hippie and super, super cool, says he always waits until he's hired to ask for the accommodation, doesn't ask for or to disclose his mental illness. I personally believe that that's a good idea. That way you don't have to worry about it in the interview. Natasha, do you have any thoughts on that?
100%. I know that there are places on forms that you fill out, employment application forms, where they say, do you have a disability? Do you have an illness? Those sorts of things. You don't have to disclose that. I understand there's a box, but you can ignore that box. It's not anyone's business but yours until you actually get that job. That, to the best of my knowledge, is the case. That is your health information, and it is private until you choose to disclose it. And the thing is, if you're in an interviewing scenario, you will never be able to prove that they didn't hire you because you have a mental illness. You'll never be able to prove that, even if it's true 10 times out of 10. You still can't prove it. So remove the idea that this even could happen by not sharing that piece of information until you get the job.
I agree with that 100%. I'm a big believer in wait as long as you can. Right. Don't assume that you need the accommodation. Don't assume anything. Just go in, keep your head down, do your job. And then when you get to the point you're like, okay, I need to disclose because then you're in a better position. Again, every state differs. I want to be very, very clear, but especially when it comes to mental illness in the workplace, a lot of times, a lot of these protections kick in after 6 months or a year. It's not exactly because you're still in the probationary period where you can be let go for any reason. So as Natasha said, even if it's 10 times out of 10, unless they sent you an email saying, due to your serious and persistent mental illness, we are illegally firing you. We know the law and we do not care. You are fired anyways because of this illegal reason. Sincerely, the entire HR department, the owner of the company, you're never, ever going to get justice on that one. Natasha, thank you. So let's move on to, we've talked a lot of downer stuff, right? How to disclose discrimination, why it's important, should you hide? Let's talk about something inspirational. Natasha, what is the most inspiring story you've heard about mental illness at work?
So as I mentioned earlier, I love the story about the CEO with bipolar, 100%. I also interviewed a woman who works at Johnson and Johnson, and she actually came up with the idea of starting groups for people with mental illness. Now, she had experience with panic attacks in pregnancy, so she actually didn't have a mental illness until she was pregnant, and then found that, oh my gosh, all of a sudden she did. And then she realized that in her workplace there weren't the kinds of resources that needed to be there for people with mental illness. And so she literally started as one person developing a group for people with mental illness in the company. And now thousands of people around the world are involved in groups for people with mental illness at that company. And that's shocking, right? One person made that kind of a difference in such a major company. And I think that that is incredibly inspiring, because that means not only do you have your own things to consider when there's mental illness in the workplace, but even if you don't have a mental illness in the workplace, you can actually help people just by being an advocate and by making sure that the resources that people with mental illness actually need are available to them in the workplace. So there actually have been multiple inspiring stories. And I think that there are really positives to people having mental illness in the workplace. This is what one of my guests said to me. She said, people with mental illness are incredibly resilient. They have to be, because they live with mental illness every single day. Employers always want resilient employees. Resilience is one of those words we hear all the time in psychology. How to become resilient? What is resilience? Blah, blah, blah. Well, people with mental illness have that quality 100% of the time, and they have to. So when you take that quality and you move it into the workplace, it's actually something really positive.
Natasha, I absolutely love that. Thank you so much. There has to be an upside. I mean, and I don't mean that as snarky as it sounds. I'm not saying that having a serious and persistent mental illness is a gift bestowed upon us, but like anything, we have to manage an illness, and that does bestow some. We grow up fast,
Yes.
right? I remember when I was in my early 20s, I understood healthcare better than every other 20-year-old, because they had never had to do it. Whereas I had filled out insurance forms. I had dealt with the beast. So the very first time they turned 35, the age comes for us all eventually. They're like, how do I do this? I'm like, I'm your guy. And that translates over in so many ways, just because we've had so many experiences that typically your workers have not had to have gone through, especially your younger workers, because there's only so much adversity that you have an opportunity to go through when you're 22, 25. And
Absolutely.
if you're managing that illness well, that's a lot to overcome. And that's we can't put that on the resume, Natasha. Why can't we put that on the resume?
Resilience, check mark. Yeah, I don't think it really works that way, but it should. Yeah, maybe we could put a box on LinkedIn where we could just a little check box. Resilient, check. Yeah.
Have you accomplished something that none of your peers have? Yes, no.
Absolutely, yes.
Click. I have. Natasha. All right. Some folks are saying that they love that point. I agree. I love that point as well. Moving on to the next question. So we've talked about a lot of things. Let's talk about resources. I think that there are. It's important to have facts and resources. Please understand that this is not an exhaustive list or an I mean, just don't say Natasha told me I can only use this one source. Natasha is not. I don't even know what she's going to say. I already know she's not saying that. Natasha, resources for mental illness in the workplace. Go.
So the one that I use actually pretty much every week when I'm looking at what we're going to be talking about on the podcast is the Center for Mental Health in the Workplace by the American Psychiatric Association. And that obviously is a data-driven website where they talk about everything to do with mental health at work. And yes, that does include mental illness in the workplace. So you can look up things like anxiety in the workplace and eating disorders in the workplace and that kind of thing, whatever you might need to know. I think that for most employees in large corporations, there's employee resource plans. I am not an expert in that, but I know that they are available for people. And then, of course, I think another good resource taken outside of work just a little bit are things like NAMI, are things like the DBSA, are things of that nature, because those organizations are going to have a lot of experience with people with mental illness in the workplace as well. And they're going to be able to guide you to possibly things you hadn't thought of.
I think the important thing is one, look around, right? There's that meme that says we all have infinite knowledge in our phones that we keep in our pockets and we use it to argue with strangers and watch cat videos. Uh, do a little Googling, but also double check and make sure that the site is valuable. Advice that I always give when looking at resources and evaluating resources is don't marry it. I'm so many people are like, I read it online, it must be true. And somebody offers additional information, fills in the blanks a little bit. People are like, no, I like the first one better, so it's true now. You have to be a little bit nimble on this for a few reasons. One, the information that you get online could in fact be wrong. Two, it could have been right when the article was written, but as we have learned, established laws can change very rapidly. Especially state laws or local laws, they can change very, very fast. So it's certainly important to remember that the information that you got is up to date. Look at the date on the article. If it's from 2017, it may not be good anymore. But Natasha, you left out the coolest one, which is your podcast. What I like about your podcast is, one, I like podcasts. I just like super hard stop there. Articles can get cumbersome and boring to read. And I mean that with all due respect to somebody who's written 1,000 of them, Natasha. But sincerely, right? Especially if you're looking for a lot of information and you go from article to article, and especially, articles like this, they're constrained by fact. They're not meant to be entertaining. They're not meant to be exciting. So they can become difficult to read very, very quickly. So I love the podcast format because, of course, Natasha's personality comes out, the guest personality come out. It's lively, but the information is factual. And Natasha is a hell of a researcher. So I got to tell you, the information on that show, anything that comes out of Natasha's mouth is going to be valid the second that she says it. I still recommend double checking. She's not infallible.
Yes, always. Yeah.
Always. But you have very cool guests. As you alluded to, you have a lawyer coming on to talk about this. You had a person, I got to be on the show, which was very, very cool, talking about my personal experience, right? And how it hit me and how it impacted me as the employee. And since Natasha has a large contingent of employers that listen to this, we're hoping that one of them listened and said, I didn't think about it from that perspective. And all of that will shift the needle. So I know I've now plugged your show for you. But Natasha, plug your show. Tell people why they should listen in, what they can expect, and some of the topics you've previously had and that you have coming up.
Well, first of all, you should be aware that my podcast and all the information about it is at snapoutofitpodcast.com. That's the first thing. You can also find that information on my website, of course, at natashatracy.com. But what I like to do in this particular podcast is I like to talk a little bit of factual information about the mental illness topics. It's actually snapoutofitpodcast.com. So I like to talk a little bit about some factual information about the mental illness topics that we'll be covering in any type of podcast. And then I like to introduce the guest, and our guests have been fascinating, right? So last week there was someone with ADHD and binge eating disorder. Now, do people think about ADHD and binge eating disorder in the workplace? Not usually, but having those two illnesses impacted him dramatically, and he didn't get a diagnosis until he was 44 years old. So hearing about his personal story and how, how being neurodivergent affected him so dramatically was great. And the thing about the guests that I've had on the show is these are really successful people at major companies by and large. And the reason why that matters is because I like to think that it's really hopeful for people. If an executive from a major company can manage with this mental illness, hopefully you can too. Or you can take a piece of information that person shares and use it to better manage your own mental illness. I mean, we're not all going to be executives at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, right? We're not going to do that. But we are all going to have some degree of needing to be productive with a mental illness. And so these people all have these valuable gifts to offer in the way that they have managed it, the things they've done right, the things that maybe haven't been so great, and where they are today.
Natasha, thank you so much. I finally got the right website. It is snapoutofitpodcast.com, and I placed it in the comments section, so you can just click, or of course you can just type in snapoutofitpodcast.com and head over there. Also, Natasha Tracy's website is on the screen, natashatracy.com. You could probably also just Google Natasha, not even Natasha Tracy, just Natasha.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. There are actually famous people with that name. So
fine. Natasha, thank you so much for shining a great big light on mental illness in the workplace. It wasn't exactly talked about a lot before the pandemic, and especially in the age of mental health, or mental health in the workplace, which is super important. Please keep talking about mental health in the workplace. Just carve out a little place for mental illness in the workplace so that we can catch everybody. Natasha, thank you so much for being here and for agreeing to do this.
Thank you so much, Gabe. It's been lovely.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to tell you to go, as soon as I find it, go to NAMI, Tennessee, go to NAMITN.org and sign up for our email list. It is absolutely free and is how you find out about the cool things like this that we're doing. We will see everybody next time on NAMI Tennessee at Home Live.